I have a mental illness and I am not the only one. In the UK, 1 in 4 people will experience some sort of mental health problem each year. In any given week, 8 in 100 people will be diagnosed with mixed depression and anxiety, 4 in 100 with PTSD. More complex conditions like BPD and psychosis are diagnosed to less than 2 in 100 people in their lifetime. It's safe to assume that within these people, there is an overlap with those that play video games. In 2019, 50.16% of people played video games in the UK, either on some sort of console or on a PC. With 73% of people aged 14 to 24 playing video games, there is so much cause for concern in the media about how it affects our youth. Common concerns are about violence, addiction, and their ability to be social. But how are video games affecting young players' perceptions on people with mental health? Studies have shown that early exposure to stereotypical depictions of mental health and mental illnesses can cause anxiety and fear in young audiences, which then in turn results in people avoiding individuals with mental illness. So the question then poses, what exactly are the stereotypical depictions of mental illness that we are currently being exposed to in video games? Media priming refers to the impact of exposure to media and the subsequent judgments, prejudice, or behaviours that follow. A modern study indicated that media can prime stereotypes that influence the way we perceive people, and therefore that media as a more broad spectrum should be considered as we are constantly consuming new forms of media. This includes video games, not just film and television. In a paper called Media Influences on Self-Stigma of Seeking Psychological Services, the Importance of Media Portrayals and Person Perception, it was noted that television and movies are very powerful tools when it comes to influencing societal perceptions. Therefore, the portrayals of the mental health community and its members in media directly contribute, as well as indirectly, to self-stigma. As a result of media-influenced stigma, 1/3 of the UK public think that people with a mental illness are likely to be violent. However, the truth of the matter is that people with severe mental health issues are more likely to be the victims rather than the perpetrators of a violent crime. This is because they are more dangerous to themselves than they are to other people, with 80 to 90% of people that commit suicide experiencing some sort of mental health distress. 𝒎𝒊𝒄, and Schneider theorise that there are 6 predominant stereotypes in cinema and television that are the main contributors to stigma: the rebellious free spirit, the homicidal maniac, the female patient as a seductress, the enlightened member of society, the narcissistic parasite, and the zoo specimen. These were deduced from movies and television 30 years ago, and since then there has been a rise in new forms of media. In an attempt to see how these potentially outdated tropes would work for video games, a study was conducted to analyse how the characters of the 50 best-selling video games from 2000 to 2013 fit into the tropes based on negative stereotypes. This included games such as Borderlands 2, Call of Duty Black Ops 2, and Tomb Raider. Using this data set and removing any duplicate titles from across the 3 years left 96 titles to be analysed, 23 of which showed 42 unique characters that were identified to have some sort of mental illness or portray some sort of mental illness. After categorising these characters into the various tropes, the researchers found that the majority, 29 characters, which translates to 69%, fit into the homicidal maniac trope. 2, or 4.8%, fit into the zoo specimen, and 1 single character, 2.4%, fit into the narcissistic parasite category. This then left 10 characters, roughly 23.8% of them, not fitting into any of the tropes that were proposed in the previous paper by 𝒎𝒊𝒄, and Schneider. This suggests that, as I stated, the tropes are in fact outdated, and the information suggests that most video games portray people with mental health issues to be violent, perpetuating a lot of the negative stereotypes. Using one dataset is not enough to form an unbiased understanding of the current representation of mental health in video games, so other studies and analysis are needed. In a study titled Gaming Against Stigma, an analysis of mental illness messages in video games, researchers looked into games found on Steam. Based on specific search criteria, 100 games were selected as they reference mental illness either by showing a mental illness itself, its treatment, or setting of care. Of these, 97% portrayed well-known stereotypes and judgments that are associated with mental illness, especially psychosis, including violence, being scary or fearful, being isolated, and being unlikely to get better. This is extremely problematic because these are partial, negative, and limited portrayals. Similarly, Dickens discussed the representation of mental illness in specifically horror video games, as the horror genre influences the public through misinforming people and discriminating against mental health patients, treatments, carers, and their environments. The study specifically looked at The Evil Within, Outlast, A Chair in a Room, Greenwater, and The Park, and their representation of mental health, which were all found to reinforce negative stereotypes of the illnesses and treatments through images of horrific asylums, violent patients, evil caregivers, and the modern use of electroshock therapy as a form of punishment. A prime example from this study of these games showing a villainized form of mental health is in the form of the character Alter Ego from The Evil Within. This is a monster created from a person with DID, or dissociative identity disorder, that the player must fight. This is damaging, as not only is DID being personified in a monstrous way, but the name of the character is also mocking the condition. Both studies noted that, as a limitation, there was no first-hand gameplay that was performed by the researchers due to a lack of funding and time restraints. This may sully the results and leave it down to bias. However, with the internet, there are videos of gameplay and detailed wikis for video games and their characters, which researchers can and have used to draw their own conclusions. The minimal literature that is available on mental illness in games has consistently found that games are to be populated with negative, stereotyped portrayals, adopting the tropes that television and film use. However, as researchers showed, there are still 20% of characters that do not fit these tropes and are not able to be categorized for analysis purposes as a result. As the 6 theorized types of mental health in media perpetuate negative stereotypes and don't create space for all characters in video games to fit into for analysis purposes, it is important to create another framework for categorizing representations. In a paper titled Representation of Mental Illness in Video Games, a new multi-dimensional approach to look at psychopathy in video games was proposed, consisting of 3 dimensions. Each one explores different level of representation, from broad, passing references to defining features that are not further explored during gameplay to essential and fully realized components of the game. For example, a one-dimensional approach would acknowledge that mental illness exists in the game world but is not in any way important to the game. This can include references to mental illness in characters' names, such as Blaine the Insane in Guild Wars 2. To make a one-dimensional representation positive, game developers could remove the use of stigmatized name calling and replace it with brief mentions of NPCs going to therapy or medications in environment. A two-dimensional representation would show a mental illness as a defining trait of a story, setting, or character, but is only ever surface level. The game never explores it further, and it serves as a convenient plot point with little need for an explanation from the developers. The Suffering is a game where players take control of a prisoner that frequently experiences PTSD flashbacks of his trauma and takes Zombium, a fictional antipsychotic, as a way of maintaining his delusions, and is a prime example of this category in a negative context. Oppositely, Life is Strange shows a non-stigmatizing representation of how depression can affect people with the character Kate. You can slowly observe her room becoming messier and her attitude bleaker before she tries to kill herself by jumping off the roof. Lastly, a three-dimensional representation has characters, negatives, and settings that are essential and fully realized, and not just for convenient plot points or backstory. These have a depth to them and examine the experience of mental illness, and as a result, are mostly positive representations of mental health and its experiences. For example, Depression Quest talks about the daily struggles of dealing with depression, how it affects work and relationships, as well as treatments. A key mechanic in the gameplay is that players often cannot choose a response that would seem the most logical, as this is often what it can be like when suffering from depression. As a result of the game being a realistic depression, it received good feedback due to it being educational and providing a way for people to seek help. Games that fit into the three-dimensional category should, in theory, always be positive representations of mental health conditions. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is another example of just that. In the game, the titular character must battle her psychosis alongside other challenges along her vision quest to save the soul of her recently deceased lover. People that suffer from psychosis are some of the most stigmatized members of society, and as a result are more likely to experience discrimination, especially in the workplace and health care. A study used Hellblade to see if the use of avatars can reduce stigma through identification, an imaginative process where players adopt the characters' traits throughout their gameplay experience. The results showed that people that played the game for 45 minutes showed a reduction in the desire to distance themselves socially from those with mental illness. Part of the reason why Hellblade has such a good representation is that it was made in partnership with a psychosis specialist, Dr. Fletcher. Another paper that used the game as a case study states that game developers should continue to collaborate with experts when depicting mental illness, especially when it comes to serious games in as early stages of designing as possible. This is not the only paper that discusses the idea of game development being in collaboration with healthcare professionals to achieve a realistic, non-stigmatizing representation of mental health. Using Batman Arkham Asylum as a microcosm for the gaming industry, authors discussed that using games to promote mental health should include collaboration with healthcare professionals, and that they should, in turn, be campaigning to produce effective regulations to promote less discriminatory content. Similarly to Hellblade, The Cat Lady deals with a lot of mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and grief. The writer of the game is a part-time developer and works as a nurse, and is used to seeing these sorts of conditions in his patients and their families, so was able to use his experiences to aid the creation. Moving forward, it is clear that stigma can be reduced through the use of collaboration in game development, and with games like this starting to carve the way, the representation of mental health in games can improve for better. At the beginning of this video, I asked how mental illness was currently being depicted in video games. Though there was not a lot of research available to me, and that itself has been documented as a concern, The general consensus is that most video games perpetuate negative stereotypes and contribute towards stigma, be it either public or self. Having said that, we cannot discredit the games that have done well in reducing the stigma surrounding mental illnesses, especially some of the worst stigmatized conditions. We have come so far in improving the representation of mental health in video games, but it's obvious we still have so much work to do, particularly when it comes to horror games, as mental illnesses serve as a convenient backstory and plot in many games. However, for more progress to be made in the practical, more progress needs to be made in the theory. Research into the representation of mental health in video games and the effect it can have on their players' views on people that belong to the mental health community must continue and improve for the industry to make a change for the better.